It was late at night in New Haven, Connecticut, in 1935. The city was fast asleep under a thin layer of mist, and the weak glow from the pale yellow lanterns flickered faintly in the darkness. The autumn breeze swept by, carrying the faint scent of magnolias, as if telling old stories mixed with the private sorrows of lonely souls. In this setting, a small wooden house nestled by a river like a rare peaceful haven during a time of turmoil. The flickering light of the lantern on the porch was like an unyielding flame of hope. Under the dim moonlight by the river, the pale yellow lantern hanging on the porch of Ethan Lynn's small wooden house flickered like a beacon of hope in a time of war. He was a lonely scholar, carrying the heartache of a fading memory of his family. He found solace in poetry and his backyard magnolia garden. On that fateful night, Lieutenant Colonel Charles "Charlie" Chu, a veteran with the scars of war, followed the light of the lantern through the mist. From that moment, two strangers' hearts unexpectedly intertwined, finding refuge in each other amid the smoke and fire of battle. Handwritten letters, a silver badge, and the soft light of the lantern became silent witnesses to an unbreakable promise. Despite the harsh times, they bravely overcame separation and sorrow to finally find each other in a valley in the American South, where magnolias bloomed and their love became immortal. It was the autumn of 1935 in New Haven, during the turbulent years of the Great Depression. The river flowed quietly, reflecting the pale yellow lanterns hanging along the ancient streets. Winding alleys echoed with the night cries of street vendors, blending with the gentle autumn breeze to create a soft, melancholic symphony. In a small wooden house nestled within a magnolia garden, Ethan Lynn sat by the window, a weathered old book in his hands. The lantern by the door shone down, casting a golden hue on the pages and highlighting his elegant face. Dressed in a pristine white suit with his long black hair loosely tied, Ethan looked like a scholar who had stepped out of an ancient painting. His eyes were deep, seemingly containing a universe of untold memories. He was the only son of the Lynn family, once renowned for their scholarship and poetry in New Haven. His father, Arthur Lynn, was a profound scholar who spent his life studying classics and literature. But with the changing times, the Lynn family's assets were confiscated by a corrupt official amidst the chaos. His mother had passed away early from illness, leaving Ethan with a faint memory and an inexpressible, deep-seated loneliness. This small wooden house, the magnolia garden, and the river were all that remained of his family. Ethan chose a reclusive life, quietly staying away from political conflicts and the expanding war. He read books, copied poems, and tended to his small garden, seeking a rare sense of peace in the chaotic era. The lantern by the window was not just a source of light but also a companion that comforted him through long, solitary nights. The magnolias around the house still bloomed, their gentle fragrance a silent comfort to his lonely soul. That night, the bright moon hung high, and the autumn breeze, carrying the scent of flowers, wafted through the window into the quiet room. Ethan Lynn was reading a poem by an ancient poet, his voice soft as if whispering to himself. Under the pale moon, I gaze at the river, my heart longing for my old home. Suddenly, a tall figure appeared outside the window. The man wore a dark blue military uniform and held a cap in his hand. His sharp yet somber eyes hid the exhaustion of someone who had been through battle. The moonlight shone on his face, revealing a faint scar on his left cheek and wrinkles on his forehead, the unmistakable marks of war. It was Charles "Charlie" Chu, a young lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He had just returned from the European front, where fierce battles had taken place. His unit had just been through a brutal fight, and he was one of the few survivors. His uniform was torn, his shoes caked with mud, and his gloomy eyes told the story of difficult times. Charles had gotten lost after the battle, and the light from Ethan Lynn's lantern had led him there, like a lighthouse in the dark night. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," Charles said, his voice deep but hesitant. He bowed, feeling awkward for disturbing someone else's peace. "I got lost after the battle. This light guided me from afar. Could I have some water and directions, please?" Ethan Lynn looked up, a momentary surprise in his eyes that quickly softened. He put his book down, stood up, and walked to the door. The lantern's light shone on his face, highlighting a gentle smile. "Please, come in. It's cold out there. War makes people lose their way, I understand." His voice was warm, as if to melt the tension on Charles's face. Charles hesitated for a moment, then nodded, stepping into the small but cozy room with its old wooden table, crowded bookshelves, and the faint scent of magnolias. Ethan Lynn poured a cup of hot tea and placed it in front of Charles. "Drink up. You need to stay warm on a cold night like this," he said, then sat down opposite him, his eyes curiously observing the young soldier. Charles picked up the cup, his rough hands, calloused from holding a gun for so long, trembling slightly. He took a sip and sighed, as if shedding some of his fatigue. "Thank you. My name is Charles Chu, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. It's been a long day." "I'm Ethan Lin," the scholar replied with a smile. "You don't need to be so formal. War is a matter for the whole country. No one wants it to happen. Did you come from the European front?" Charles nodded, his eyes distant. "Yes, we just went through a major battle in Europe. Many of my comrades are gone," he said, his voice choking up. "I just wanted to come back to New Haven to report the news to my family, but I got lost in the night." Ethan Lin listened, his eyes filled with empathy. "Don't worry. Stay here tonight, and I'll help you find your way in the morning. War has taken too much. This is the least I can do." The two began to talk. Charles told him about his days on the battlefield, the long nights in military tents with the sound of gunshots echoing, and the comrades who fell for the ideal of protecting their homeland. Ethan Lin listened, occasionally interjecting with stories about poetry and the verses of famous poets that he loved. He talked about his small house, his father, and the peaceful days he had lost. Under the warm yellow light of the lantern, time seemed to stand still, with only their voices blending with the gentle breeze. As the moon rose higher, Charles unexpectedly took Ethan's hand. The action startled them both, but his gaze remained steady. "If I survive this war, I'll come back. Will you wait for me?" he asked, his voice trembling as he feared a rejection. Ethan Lin blushed, but his eyes didn't look away. "I'll wait. No matter how fierce the war gets, I believe you will return." He squeezed Charles's hand lightly, a silent promise. That night, under the lantern's light and the scent of flowers and grass, a new feeling blossomed between two strangers. The old lantern with its warm yellow light became a silent witness to that fated moment in the chaotic era of America. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the tree leaves and the wooden window into Ethan Lin's small house. The chirping of birds in the garden, combined with the gentle sound of the river, created a rare peaceful scene amidst the chaos. Charles Chu woke up on the simple wooden bed that Ethan Lin had given him. His military uniform was still covered in dust, but his face looked less tense after a good night's sleep. The fragrant scent of tea from the small kitchen awakened all his senses. Ethan Lin stood by the stove, stirring a pot of sticky rice porridge with lotus seeds that he had prepared early that morning. He wore a thin jacket, and his eyes were brighter than they had been the night before. Hearing the movement, he turned and smiled when he saw Charles was awake. "You're up. The porridge is almost ready. Please have a seat." Charles nodded, walked to the old wooden table, and sat down. He felt the warmth of this home, something he hadn't experienced in a long time on the battlefield. "Thank you, Ethan Lin. I didn't expect to be treated so kindly after months of nothing but guns and bullets." Ethan Lin placed a bowl of porridge in front of Charles and sat opposite him. "War separates people, but sometimes it also brings us together. Eat up, then I'll help you find your way back to New Haven." The two ate in silence, but the atmosphere between them was not at all awkward. After the meal, Ethan Lin took out an old map of his father's and showed Charles the shortest way to return to the barracks. Charles listened carefully, but his heart didn't want to leave just yet. There was something in Ethan Lin's gentle eyes that made him feel safe, a feeling he had lost long ago. Before leaving, Charles turned to Ethan Lin with a serious look in his eyes. "I will come back after I finish my mission. Please keep your promise and wait for me." He took off his military badge, placing it in Ethan Lin's hand. "This is a memento. If I don't return, keep it as a reminder." Ethan Lin held the badge tightly, feeling the weight of Charles's words. "I will wait. You must survive. That's the most important thing." Charles nodded, then turned and walked away. His figure gradually disappeared behind the trees, leaving Ethan Lin standing silently by the window, his hand still holding the badge, his eyes following him. The old lantern was still hanging there, its pale yellow light a silent promise between the two. Time passed, and the war grew fiercer. Charles was sent to the Western Front, where enemy forces were fiercely attacking major cities. He became a young commander, leading his troops through bloody battles. Whenever he had a moment's rest, he would take out paper and a pen to write letters to Ethan Lin, sending them through messengers. Those letters were not just messages, they were a way for him to keep his heart from growing cold on the battlefield. Ethan Lin stayed in the small house, waiting for each letter from Charles. He carefully stored them in a wooden box, reading and rereading the shaky but affectionate words. One letter read, "It's raining heavily today, and I miss your lantern light. The war is cruel, but thinking of you gives me strength." Ethan Lynn smiled every time he read those lines, but deep down, he was endlessly worried. One day, when the magnolias in the garden began to shed their leaves, signaling the coming of winter, a soldier appeared at Ethan Lynn's door. He brought the last letter from Charles, but it was not good news. In the letter, Charles wrote that he had been severely wounded in a battle in Chicago and was now missing. The soldier recounted that after being wounded, Charles had ordered his comrades to retreat, while he himself was surrounded by the enemy. No one knew if he was still alive or had died. Ethan Lynn read the letter, his hands trembling so much that he dropped the badge. He knelt to pick it up, tears streaming down his cheeks. "No, he can't be dead," he whispered, trying to convince himself. He held the badge tightly, telling himself that Charles was still alive somewhere and that he would continue to wait. Ethan Lynn's life gradually became gloomy. Rumors of Charles's death spread, while his family also fell into a desperate situation. A group of corrupt officials, the same ones who had once stolen the Lynn family's property, returned to seize the small house. They threatened Ethan Lynn, forcing him to leave if he didn't want to be in danger. Heavy-hearted, Ethan Lynn packed a few precious items, his father's books, the letterbox, the lantern, and fled New Haven, escaping to a small village by a river. There, he found work at an old bookstore. He diligently copied and sold books to make a living. Every night, under the lantern's light, he wrote in his diary, recording his memories with Charles. He wrote about their late-night conversations, their promises under the moon, and his endless longing. The badge was placed next to the lantern as a reminder that he was still patiently waiting. One spring afternoon, as the magnolias in the village began to bloom, Ethan Lynn suddenly heard heavy footsteps outside the bookstore. He looked up, his heart stopping when he saw a familiar figure. Charles, his body covered in wounds, his hair a mess, but his eyes still bright, smiled weakly at him. He had survived the perilous days, rescued by his comrades and taken to a secret medical station. The two rushed into each other's arms, their tears mixing with their smiles. The old lantern was still hanging there, its pale yellow light witnessing the emotional reunion. "You promised you'd come back," Charles whispered, holding Ethan Lynn tightly. "And I waited for you," Ethan Lynn choked out. "I never gave up hope. You are everything I have." Under the lantern's light, they held each other, forgetting the painful years. The promise made long ago was finally fulfilled in the chaotic era of America. In the small village by the river, the afternoon sun faded as dusk fell, painting the surrounding magnolia fields a golden yellow, creating a rare peaceful beauty. Ethan Lynn and Charles sat together under the lantern hanging on the porch. The quiet space was only broken by the gentle sound of the nearby stream. After their emotional reunion, they wanted to make up for the years of separation. Charles recounted in detail what had happened after the battle in Chicago, while Ethan Lynn listened, his eyes filled with both sorrow and happiness. Charles began his story from the day he was wounded. After ordering his comrades to retreat, he was surrounded by enemy soldiers. A bullet lodged in his shoulder, causing him to fall in the smoky battlefield. He vaguely remembered being rescued by a group of local soldiers and taken to a secret medical station deep in the forest. There, nurses took care of him, but the infected wound caused him to be in a coma for many days. When he awoke, he knew he couldn't continue fighting, but the thought of his promise to Ethan Lynn kept him alive. "Every time I was in pain, I only thought of your lantern, and that gave me strength," Charles said, holding Ethan Lynn's hand tightly. Ethan Lynn smiled, tears streaming down his face. "Me too. Every night I looked at the badge and told myself you were still alive somewhere. Now that you're here, I'm not afraid of anything anymore." However, their joy was short-lived. News of Charles's return spread quickly in the village, and it didn't escape the eyes of his old enemies. The corrupt officials in New Haven, who had once seized the Lynn family's property, had heard rumors of Charles's presence, a military officer who could cause trouble for them. One evening, as the two were preparing to close the bookstore, a group of strangers appeared, carrying sticks and with fierce eyes. "Chew, it's good that you're still alive, but don't dream of peace," the leader, a plump man in a shabby vest, roared. "I have orders from New Haven to bring you back for military information, and as for that Ethan Lynn, I'll take back his old house." Charles immediately stood in front of Ethan Lynn, his hand gripping the short sword he still kept with him. "If you want something, come to me. Don't touch him," he yelled, his voice firm, but with a body still weak from his wounds, He wasn't strong enough to fight the crowd. A wooden stick swung at him, hitting his shoulder and making him fall. Ethan Lynn screamed, rushing to help Charles, but they were both taken away in the dark of the night. They were brought to an abandoned warehouse near the village, where the official was waiting. He interrogated Charles about the army's location and battle plans, but Charles remained silent. Ethan Lynn was tied up in a corner of the room, tears streaming down his face as he watched Charles being beaten. "Don't hurt him, I beg you," he cried, but was only met with laughter. Fortunately, it didn't last long. A group of local soldiers, who had known of Charles's bravery on the battlefield, discovered the kidnapping. They attacked the warehouse at midnight, rescuing both of them. After the brawl, the officials fled, leaving Charles and Ethan Lynn exhausted. The leading soldier, a sergeant named Louis, helped Charles to his feet. "Lieutenant Colonel, you have to leave here. These people won't give up." Ethan Lynn nodded, though his heart was heavy. "We can't stay here anymore, but where do we go now?" Charles, though in pain, held Ethan Lynn's hand tightly. "Let's go to the south. I have an old friend there, a farmer named James, who will help us." With Louis's help, the two left the village in the night, taking the lantern and a few personal belongings with them. The journey to the south was not easy. The roads were rough, the weather was cold, and Charles's wounds grew worse. Ethan Lynn used his basic medical knowledge from his father's books to take care of him, changing his bandages and boiling herbs to relieve the pain. Every night, they rested under a large tree, the lantern's light their only source of illumination in the deep forest. After many days, they arrived at a small valley in the south. Charles's friend, a farmer named James, welcomed them warmly. He was a retired veteran who lived a reclusive life with his small family. "You too can stay here. No one will find you," James said, pointing to a simple but clean wooden house. Ethan Lynn and Charles were grateful and began to get used to their new life. Ethan Lynn helped James's family grow flowers and copybooks, while Charles learned how to garden and fix things. Though their life was simple, they found joy in the moments they shared. The lantern, hanging on the porch, became a symbol of their hope and love. However, the past would not let go. One day, Louis appeared with bad news. The officials in New Haven had sent people to hunt for Charles, accusing him of betraying the army to shirk his responsibilities. They also threatened to destroy James's family if they didn't hand over Charles. He decided to face them, even though Ethan Lynn begged him to stay. "I can't let others be in danger because of me," Charles said, his eyes firm. "You stay here. I'll come back after I've resolved this." Ethan Lynn hugged him tightly, tears streaming down his face. "Don't go. I've lost you once. I can't bear it again." Charles kissed Ethan Lynn's forehead and whispered, "Trust me. I'll come back just like last time." With Louis's help, Charles left, leaving Ethan Lynn in a state of worry. Ethan Lynn sat under the lantern's light, praying for his loved one to survive once more. The badge remained in his hand, a reminder of the promise they had made. Life in the South grew more tense. Ethan Lynn helped James reinforce the house, preparing for a possible attack. Every night, he wrote letters to Charles, even though he didn't know if they would ever reach him. He wrote about the magnolias that had bloomed, the gurgling of the stream, and his endless longing. The letters were carefully stored in a wooden box, a part of the memory he hoped to share with Charles when they were reunited. A week passed without any news. Ethan Lynn began to panic, but he didn't give up. He believed that Charles would keep his promise, just as the lantern continued to burn brightly every night, despite the wind and storms. In the Southern Valley one late afternoon, the last rays of sunlight painted the magnolia fields golden, bringing a rare peaceful beauty. Ethan Lynn sat on the porch, a quill in his hand, writing another letter to Charles. The old lantern hanging next to him was still lit, its pale yellow light a flame of hope as darkness fell. 10 days had passed since Charles left to face his pursuers, and each day was a test of Ethan Lynn's patience. He wrote with trembling hands, "Where are you? I'm afraid I won't have the chance to tell you how much I love you." James came out of the kitchen with a cup of hot tea. "Don't worry too much, Ethan. Charles is a strong soldier. He will come back." Ethan Lynn offered a weak smile, thanking him, but his heart was still filled with worry. He looked at the military badge next to the lantern, telling himself that as long as it was there, Charles was still alive. Meanwhile, Charles was facing a different kind of war. After leaving the valley, he and Louis went to a small town near New Haven to confront the corrupt officials. With help from some old comrades, he gathered evidence of their crimes, from embezzling public funds to extorting soldiers' families. However, the confrontation was not easy. One evening, while meeting a witness, Charles was ambushed. A group of the official's thugs attacked him, and he was severely wounded again. This time, it was a deep cut on his arm. Louis managed to help him escape in time, but Charles's condition grew more critical. "He can't go on like this," a worried Louis said, bandaging Charles's wound in a makeshift tent. "We have to take him back to the south immediately." Charles shook his head, though his face was pale. "No, I have to finish this. Otherwise, Ethan Lynn and James's family will never be safe." He gritted his teeth, enduring the pain, determined to complete his mission. With Louis's help, he continued to gather evidence and finally convinced a high-ranking military official to intervene. The corrupt officials were arrested, and Charles's honor was restored, but the price he paid was a seriously depleted health. After everything settled down, Charles began his journey back to the south. Each step was a challenge, but the thought of Ethan Lynn was the greatest motivation that kept him going. He brought a small gift with him, a jade ring he bought in town, as an apology for making Ethan Lynn worry for so long. In the valley, Ethan Lynn's despair grew. One morning, when the magnolias began to shed their leaves, signaling autumn, he decided to leave the house and go look for Charles. He took the lantern and the badge, planning to go to New Haven to ask for news. James tried to stop him, but couldn't shake his resolve. "If he doesn't come back, I won't be able to live," Ethan Lynn said, choking back tears. Just as he was stepping out the gate, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the path. It was Charles, his body thin, his clothes torn, walking slowly but with bright eyes. Ethan Lynn dropped the lantern and ran to embrace him. "You're back. I thought I had lost you," he cried, holding Charles tightly as if afraid he would disappear. Charles smiled weakly, stroking Ethan Lynn's hair. "I promised I'd come back, and nothing could stop me." He took out the jade ring and put it on Ethan Lynn's finger. "This is my apology for making you worry." The two sat on the porch under the soft light of the lantern. Charles recounted everything: the confrontation with the officials, his new wounds, and how he had defended his honor so they could live in peace. Ethan Lynn listened, occasionally hugging him tightly when he heard about the dangerous moments. "You're so foolish," he whispered, but the smile on his face was filled with gratitude. James and his family also came out to welcome Charles, bringing food and tea to celebrate his return. That evening's dinner was a small but meaningful feast. Laughter and stories echoed through the peaceful valley. After all the waiting, the lantern finally got to witness the happy moment it had kept hope alive for. However, Charles's wounds were not to be taken lightly. A few days later, he developed a high fever, his body weakened by blood loss and infection. Ethan Lynn took care of him devotedly, using the medical knowledge from his father's books to treat him. He boiled herbal water, changed his bandages, and stayed up all night to wipe the sweat from Charles's brow. James brought in a local doctor, who prescribed medicine and advised absolute rest. "You have to get better," Ethan Lynn whispered when Charles woke up one rainy night. "I can't lose you again." Charles took his hand, his voice weak. "I'm not going anywhere. As long as I have you, I'll get through this." The recovery process lasted for weeks. Ethan Lynn never left his side, reading poetry and telling stories to keep Charles's spirits up. The lantern became their only source of light during the rainy nights, a silent companion. Finally, Charles's health gradually stabilized, though he was still weak. The two began to plan their future, deciding to build a new life in this valley. One afternoon, when Charles could walk again, he and Ethan Lynn planted a new magnolia tree in front of the house. "This will be our memento," Charles said, holding the shovel with Ethan Lynn. "When it blooms, we'll have a small celebration." Ethan Lynn smiled and nodded. "I'll write a poem to commemorate that day." Under the lantern's light, they worked together, forgetting the wounds of the past. Their love, like the flame in the lantern, had survived war, separation, and harsh trials. They knew that the future still held many challenges, but together they could face anything. Ethan Lynn, with his literary talent, continued to write and copy books, sometimes selling them to passing merchants for extra income. The two worked together in perfect harmony, like two seamless pieces of a puzzle. One morning, with dew still on the leaves, Ethan Lynn sat on the porch, a brush in his hand, writing a new poem. Charles came out of the garden, holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables, and smiled when he saw him. "What are you writing so diligently?" he asked, putting the basket down and sitting next to Ethan Lynn. Ethan Lynn looked up, his eyes bright. "I'm writing about us, about the lantern, about the magnolias, and about the love that helped us overcome everything." He read a few lines aloud. "Under the golden light of the lamp, we found each other through fire and hardship, our love forever unchanged." Charles laughed, took his hand, and said, "That's beautiful. When the flowers bloom, we will have our anniversary celebration, and you can read this poem." Their life was not without its challenges. One day, news of the war reached the valley. Enemy forces continued to attack nearby regions, and many villages had to evacuate. James, worried, called them to a meeting. "If the war reaches us, we need a plan. This house is not sturdy enough to withstand the soldiers." Charles nodded, suggesting they reinforce the house and dig a shelter. With his military experience, he led James's family and some neighbors in the work. Ethan Lynn helped by writing down the plans and distributing tasks, ensuring everything ran smoothly. After many days of labor, the house became sturdier with a shelter large enough for the whole family. The lantern was brought into the shelter as a source of spiritual light for the dark days that might come. Even though the war had not yet reached the valley, its effects were still felt. Fewer merchants passed by, making it difficult for Ethan Lynn to sell his books. Charles suggested starting a small garden to grow vegetables and flowers, both for their own use and to sell to the villagers. The idea was more successful than they had anticipated. Their magnolias became a bright spot, attracting passers-by who bought them as gifts. Ethan Lynn also wrote some short poems, bound into small collections to be sold with the flowers, bringing in more income. One afternoon, when the magnolias were in full bloom, the two held their anniversary celebration as they had promised. They invited James and his family and a few close neighbors. A feast was laid out on the porch with tea and homemade cakes. Ethan Lynn read his poem, his warm voice echoing under the lantern's light. "Flowers bloom in the valley, love overflows, the lamp shines in the dark night, we are together forever." Everyone applauded. Charles pulled Ethan Lynn into a gentle hug and whispered, "Thank you for everything." However, their happiness was short-lived. One evening, as the two were sitting under the lantern's light, one of Charles's old soldiers appeared. He brought news that the army was still looking for Charles, suspecting him of betrayal in the case with the corrupt officials. "They don't believe you're innocent, even with the evidence. Some people want to make an example of you," the soldier said, his voice full of worry. Charles frowned and looked at Ethan Lynn. "I didn't think they'd still be after this. Maybe we have to leave again." Ethan Lynn shook his head, holding his hand tightly. "No, I don't want to keep running. We've built this life, and I won't let anyone take it away." He suggested writing a letter of explanation, sending it to a high-ranking official in the army, and asking them to re-examine the case. Charles agreed, and with James's help, the letter was sent through a trusted network. The days of waiting for a reply were tense. Ethan Lynn and Charles continued their daily tasks, but their eyes were always on the road leading into the valley. The lantern became their nightly gathering place, where they shared their worries and their hopes. One morning, when the magnolias were in full bloom, the messenger arrived with the reply. Charles opened the letter, his hands trembling. He let out a sigh of relief as he read the contents. He was declared innocent, and the warrant for his arrest was cancelled. "I'm free," Charles said, smiling and hugging Ethan Lynn. "We can finally live in peace now." Ethan Lynn's face lit up, but he knew this peace was fragile. He suggested building a new, more solid house to prepare for the future. Charles agreed, and with the help of James and the villagers, they began the project. They chose a higher location near the stream and used wood from a nearby forest. The construction process lasted for a few months, but each day was filled with joy as they worked together. The new house was completed in the autumn with a wide porch and large windows looking out over the valley. The old lantern was hung in the center, becoming the warm heart of their home. Ethan Lynn added a few pieces of his own calligraphy to the walls, while Charles built a small wooden table where they could sit to write and read. Their life gradually stabilized, with their garden and books as their livelihood and their love as their foundation. One clear full moon night, Ethan Lynn and Charles sat together under the lantern's light, hand in hand. "Did you ever think we would have a day like this?" Ethan Lynn asked, his eyes gentle and full of hope. Charles smiled, looking out at the vast valley. "No, but I always believed in your light. It led me back to you and will always do so." They hugged, letting the night wind sweep through, carrying the sweet fragrance of magnolias. Their simple life was a testament to a resilient love that had overcome all trials. The lantern, like a loyal friend, continued to burn steadily, illuminating the path for two hearts that had found each other. The Southern Valley in the spring of 1950, when the war had receded and America was entering a period of profound change. The magnolia tree in front of Ethan Lynn and Charles's house had now become an ancient tree. Every year, it bloomed with hundreds of vibrant flowers, a testament to their resilience through the years. The sturdy wooden house they built more than a decade ago still stood strong, with the old lantern hanging on the porch. Its pale yellow light still burned steadily every night. Their hair had turned silver, but their smiles and the look in their eyes for each other were as radiant as on the first day they met. The lives of Ethan Lynn and Charles had become an indispensable part of the valley. The villagers adored them for their kindness and their silent but meaningful contributions. Ethan Lynn continued to write books. His poems and stories were passed down, becoming a valuable spiritual treasure of the land. Charles, though no longer strong enough to work in the garden as before, still took care of the magnolia tree like a dear friend through all the seasons. The military badge was now kept in a small wooden box, alongside the letters they had written to each other, as a sacred memento of a time long past. One afternoon, when the magnolias were in full bloom, the two sat on the porch, hand in hand, looking at the quiet valley. James, now an old man, walked over with a gentle smile. "You two have brought peace to this place," he said, placing a cup of tea in front of them. "I don't know how much longer I have to live, but I'm happy to see you both at peace." Ethan Lynn smiled, holding James's hand. "Thank you. Without you, we wouldn't have this day." Charles nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. After James left, the two continued to talk, remembering the difficult months and the happy moments. "Do you have any regrets?" Charles asked, his voice hoarse with age but his eyes still fixed on Ethan Lynn. Ethan Lynn shook his head, smiling gently. "Never. Because of you, I waited. Because of you, I lived. Every day with you is a gift." He squeezed Charles's hand, as if to convey all the love he had held in his heart for so many years. As time passed, their health began to fail. The old war wounds left them often tired, while Ethan Lynn also had trouble with his eyes and trembling hands. They still tried to maintain their daily routines. They would go out to the garden in the morning to look at the flowers, sit under the lantern's light in the afternoon to read poetry, and hug each other to sleep in peace at night. The villagers often came to visit, bringing food and stories to make them feel less alone. One autumn evening, when the full moon was bright in the sky, Ethan Lynn felt his body was heavier than usual. He sat under the lantern's light, holding an old book his father had left behind, rereading the familiar verses. Charles came out, carrying a thin blanket and wrapping it around his shoulders. "Don't sit out too long, it's getting cold," he said, his voice gentle. Ethan Lynn looked up and smiled. "I want to read this to you one last time. This poem reminds me of the day we met." He read slowly. "Under the dim moon, we found each other through fire and hardship, our love unchanging." Charles sat down next to him, holding him close, his tears falling silently. That night, they both fell asleep under the lantern's light. The next morning, James and the villagers found them still sitting there, hand in hand, with serene smiles on their faces. They had passed away together, just as they had lived, inseparable and not missing a moment. The lantern still burned brightly, like a gentle farewell. News of Ethan Lynn and Charles's passing spread quickly through the valley. The villagers held a simple but meaningful memorial, placing two coffins next to each other under the magnolia tree. They were buried there, with the lantern placed on the grave as an eternal promise. Every year, when the magnolias bloomed, the villagers would come to light incense and retell the story of the two men's timeless love. A young boy in the village, James's son, often sat by the grave reading the poems Ethan Lynn had left behind. He added to their story, turning it into a local legend. The lantern's light never went out, for it was the symbol of the immortal love between Ethan Lynn and Charles. Time passed, the war became a memory, and the Southern Valley grew into a small town. But the magnolia tree and the lantern on the grave were still preserved as a reminder of a love that had overcome all trials. Every night, the pale yellow light from the lantern seemed to flicker, as if two souls were still there, together forever. In the end, the story of Ethan Lynn and Charles was not just a personal love story but also a symbol of hope and perseverance in a chaotic era. The lantern, through all the years, had become an eternal flame, illuminating the path for all who believe in true love. Under the moon and the flowers, they found each other, and nothing could ever separate them, not even death. Many years later, as new generations grew up in the Southern Valley, the story of Ethan Lynn and Charles's love was still recounted as a legend. It was not just a story about two people, but a testament to the power of perseverance, faith, and love that transcends the limits of time and hardship. And on every quiet night, when the moonlight covers the magnolia petals, the gentle light from the lantern still shines silently, as if to remind everyone that true love never fades, no matter how much life changes. Ethan Lynn and Charles, those two souls, are still together, not only in memory but everywhere, in the light, in the wind, and in the hearts of all who have ever believed in the miracle of love. Thank you for joining Boylove Audio on this journey of love and longing. See you again in the next stories, where love is still there, forever unchanged.